I think you mean Marie Pareto.
Oh, sorry, I'm sending it over to Marie.
Looks like Marie is muted.
Hello and welcome. I am Marie Pareto Hedin, president of the Tufts Senior Connection, a shared interest group sponsored by the Tufts University Office of Alumni Engagement. We design programs that we hope will be of special interest to alums 55 and older, but we welcome persons of all ages who find our programs relevant, intriguing, or both. Whether you love food as I do, or eat to sustain life, as human beings, we all have a relationship with food. We live in a marketing culture. The media bombards us with often conflicting food advice. For those of us who are chocoholics, can we indulge? Should we limit ourselves to dark chocolate? Should we ignore those cute M&M commercials? Further, over 60% of Americans are overweight or obese. Weight loss options appear to be in conflict. Is the low carb, high fat, ketogenic diet a healthy way to lose weight? Can intermittent fasting result in lost weight and improved health? We are pleased to have with us two guests who are well qualified to talk about this subject. We welcome back Dr. Sarah Booth, director of the Jean Mayer USDA Human Nutrition Research Center on Aging at Tufts University, HNRCA for short. She is an international leader in vitamin K research. Her current NIH-funded research investigates the role of vitamins D and K in risk of Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Dr. Booth has received multiple awards in recognition of her research. And Dr. Booth is also Vice President-elect for the American Society of Nutrition and recently named Chair of the 2025 Dietary Guidelines for Americans Advisory Committee. Dr. Edward Saltzman is the former academic dean at the Friedman School of Nutrition, Science, and Policy and division chair of the Clinical Nutrition at Tufts Medical Center. Dr. Saltzman is on faculty at the Friedman School and Tufts School of Medicine. In addition, Dr. Saltzman is the medical director of all human studies at the HNRCA. Dr. Saltzman's research focuses on obesity and body weight regulation in humans. An active teacher for which he was recently awarded the American Society of Nutrition's prestigious Educator of the Year Award, congratulations. His courses are designed to provide students of all backgrounds with an in-depth understanding of nutrition and its scientific underpinnings. They cover issues in modern nutrition, public health, and chronic disease, especially on the major non-infectious diseases present in Western countries that are caused by modifiable lifestyle choices. In a few minutes, you will be given the opportunity to ask questions. Please submit your questions into the chat box. Sarah and Ed, welcome to the Senior Connection, and thank you for being with us.
Oh, thank you very much for having us.
So Ed, would you like to start?
Always. Our presentation will be divided into two parts. The first part we have titled Not Quite Entirely Tongue-in-Cheek, a Nutrition Theater of the Absurd. This is where we demonstrate that when you take the long view, nutrition advice offered to the public borders on the absurd. Right? And we're going to be going back and forth, illustrating some of the some of the recommendations. And I just would like to say that I would never, ever dream of contradicting my underachieving wife. Shall we start?
Let's go.
Well, let's start with a simple one. Saturated fat is still bad, right?
Maybe it's not so bad after all. I mean, we know it's not as healthy as polyunsaturated fats, but maybe not too bad. There's lots of controversy here. Clearly more research is needed.
But how about overall fat in our diets? Yeah, doesn't, a lot of fat in our diets lead to gaining body fat and cause heart disease?
Fat isn't so bad. And they're really good types of fat. We shouldn't limit fat. It's actually the carbs that make us gain weight.
Well, before we get to the carbs, let's talk about those good types of fat, like omega-3 fatty acids that we might find in fish, right? We eat plenty of wild-caught salmon to make sure we get enough, but we avoid, that farm fish. That doesn't farm fish have less omega-3?
No, wild caught fish doesn't always have more omega-3 fatty acids than farm fish. It all depends on what the farm fish are fed.
Huh. All right. Well, if carbohydrates make you gain body weight, why is it that we are being encouraged to consume more plant-based diets? Don't those have more carbohydrate?
Well, when we're encouraged to consume more plant-based diets, it's to encourage us to eat minimally processed whole grains and the like.
You mean foods that taste like cardboard? Those foods? And not going to be very convenient, because where can we find those foods? And many of the foods with whole grains, it seems, are mixed with refined grains. So it's tough to figure out about this whole grain thing. Maybe we should avoid the refined grains and added sugars that go along with whole grains, and just stick to a low carb or ketogenic diet.
Well, the problem is ketogenic diets may provide short-term benefits, but there's no long-term evidence they're effective. Furthermore, there's no long-term evidence they're even safe or people would even adhere to ketogenic diets.
Okay. Well, I have a feeling we're going to be coming back to this topic in the Q&A. So let's go to high fructose corn syrup. Shouldn't that be public enemy number one? Its metabolic pathways predispose it to making, sort of lipid or fat when it gets taken up by cells in the body. It should be banned.
You've got to mention that you need to ingest about 500 calories of fructose at each time you eat it to cause those effects.
Well, you're not making this easy for us. So if there are problems with carbs, we don't agree on fat, we should eat more protein, right?
Well, the problem is excessive protein may lead to bone loss, which is even a bigger problem in older people, or maybe it's only animal protein. Or maybe it's only animal protein that doesn't lead to bone loss if you eat enough fruits and vegetables.
Country do you live in, Dr. Booth? Eating enough fruit and vegetables? What percentage of Americans actually consume the recommended amount of fruit and vegetables? Well, as long as we're talking about fruit and vegetables, we should eat organic, right? It improves the nutrient content of the food that
It actually doesn't. The only benefit of organic farming, it's not about the nutrients. It provides foods with little or no pesticide residue. And it's that pesticide residue that may hurt developing brains or might be associated with food allergies. But there's no evidence organic food is more nutritious.
Well, my brain's still developing, so I'm going to stick with organic. But how about locally produced food? Isn't local better because it requires less energy to get it to you?
Actually, maybe not. The types of transportation used for bulk transport of food may be more energy efficient than transport of local foods.
Wow. Well, it's a good thing we have these large epidemiologic studies to help us identify the most important nutrients to consume, especially if we're talking about preventing, the most common chronic diseases like heart disease and cancer.
Well, but the problem is the trials that looked at supplemental vitamin E, vitamin C, beta carotene, they actually don't show that taking supplements with these nutrients actually prevented heart disease or cancer. Furthermore, the smokers who took beta carotene supplements had higher rates of lung cancer. And vitamin E supplements in some studies showed a slight increased risk of dying.
Who knew? Well, but instead of those specific single nutrient supplements, a lot of people don't eat right sometimes, so they take a daily vitamin. That must have health benefits, right?
Sorry, studies haven't revealed any consistent long-term health benefits of those taking multivitamins. But part of the problem is the people who take multivitamins tend to be really healthy people who exercise a lot and have fantastic diets. So they're the ones taking the supplements, but they have the healthy diets.
Well, can we at least still believe in vitamin D and calcium to prevent osteoporosis?
A daily supplement of calcium and vitamin D does appear to slow bone loss, but it does not prevent or reverse osteoporosis.
Well, let's go to another topic. Many of my very closest friends on the internet say that they have gluten allergies and they feel much better after eliminating gluten from their diets. What do you think about that?
Well, celiac disease, Ed, this should have been the question that you answered, not me. How about you answer your own question?
Well, that's usually how I like to do it. So it's celiac disease is a condition that is an immune response to the proteins that comprise gluten. But a lot of people who don't have celiac disease believe they are sensitive or even allergic to gluten. But when you eliminate the gluten from your diet, you eliminate a lot of different foods. So it's really hard to know if it was the gluten that you were reacting to that made you feel, not as good as you would when you eliminate it.
So Ed, I've been focusing on superfoods recently. I figure if I consume a couple of superfoods, it will allow me to consume whatever else I want.
Yeah, well, I've noticed that you are wearing that T-shirt at home that has the S on it for superfoods. But I think that superfoods are largely a creation of the media and the food industry. They're very nutrient-dense foods, but just because something isn't labeled as a superfood doesn't mean it isn't good for us.
So I think we're just really confusing all these really nice people with all the claims of nutrition that are in the media. And maybe it's more important that we answer their questions.
Well, we can at least agree on that. So let's go to the questions.
Okay, so one of the questions, and we have paraphrased this, so our apologies if we've misunderstood the content. But one of the questions was, in the grocery store, it's hard to know how to choose among legumes, whole grains, whether I should choose starchy vegetables, non-starchy vegetables. Is there a more specific list of healthful foods than simply general recommendations? Where can I find info on diet patterns and not just foods? Do I need to read the labels? So there's a lot to unpack here, but the reason why there's a lot of focus on foods is because the foods contain the nutrients, and if you substitute foods, you need to make sure you get the adequate nutrients for health. I would recommend that anyone who wants information on diet patterns and have really good guidance on what to do when you go in the grocery store is go to the Dietary Guidelines for Americans.gov website. Just type in dietary guideline for Americans. There's a whole section on consumer information. There are different types of dietary patterns, and this will give you guidance that's based on evidence-based research and not just the whim of social media. With respect to do I need to read the labels, reading the labels are really important. And I'm going to shift this to Ed because I actually don't do the grocery shopping in our household. Ed does the grocery shopping in our household. So he can give you some information on the reading the labels.
Well, as many of you may have realized, the nutrient facts panel has recently changed, and it is more helpful because it now reflects actual serving sizes as opposed to those aspirationally small serving sizes that used to be on labels. And the nutrients of concern have also been updated. So do you need to read labels? Well, it's actually, you know, unless you really know a food, it's hard to really figure out, you know, what's in the food. So I guess the answer is you do need to read labels until you have settled on particular foods. However, you know, say if you're purchasing dried legumes and going to prepare them at home, I don't think you need to worry about labels on those unless you're looking for a particular sort or one's high in certain types of dietary fiber. But I think labels, looking at labels are generally a good thing.
And I did see, Ed, that somebody asked a question in the chat as a follow-up, how to read a food label. My recommendation is go to the FDA website and just type in food labels. And there is a fantastic site on how to read a label, what each section means, and the history of the labels. And that will really help you navigate the changes in the food labels.
Yeah, but in general, it should tell you how many calories there are in a serving, what percentage of particular, you know, your particular nutrient of concern contributes to your daily requirement. And that's both for the macronutrients, carbohydrate, protein, and fat, as well as some of the vitamins and minerals. But it is generally based on a 2,000 calorie diet, which may be high for some people as they age, although it may not.
We're just going to ask the organizers of today. A couple of people in the chat have asked us to let them know the specific websites. What we will do after today, I'm taking a note. We will make a list of all the websites, and we will have the organizers send you a list of the websites that we refer to, if that's okay with you. And then you'll have a written list. Great. Okay. So, and on that note, one of the questions is, why doesn't the public hear more about the Asian diet, which in some ways like the Mediterranean diet? Are there unique benefits with the Asian diet due to the ingredients such as ginger, shiitake mushroom, soy, etc.? I think that the person who asked this question raised a really good point that the scientific community is becoming more sensitive to. There are some healthy diet patterns, such as the US dietary pattern, the Mediterranean, but there aren't a lot of diet patterns that have been developed specific for different cultures. And one of the more important aspects right now of this question is there is a lot of research that has emerged in the last 2 to 3 years that indicates it's not the specific diet pattern. So a lot of scientists have their favorite diet pattern, but it's actually not the diet pattern per se that it gives confers health. It's the components in it. All those diet patterns have similar components: fruits and vegetables, whole grains, low sodium, very limited amount of fat, etc. So I do believe moving forward, there will be more dietary patterns that are developed that adapt to various cultures. But at the end of the day, again, if you go to the dietaryguidelines.gov, they do have a general healthy pattern, and you can adapt it to what your cultural likes, dislikes, or needs are. Then out of that, there was a question about what are some tips to avoid sugar and salt. The person who asked this already actually answered part of their question. Read labels. Yes, to Ed's point, sodium is, the labels are where you really find the amount of sodium, and I think it's can be quite staggering when you compare different brands. Preparing food at home is great, but not everybody can prepare all food at home. There's been a lot of promotion of spices and herbs because most people use sugar and salt for flavoring, and you can substitute a lot of these with herbs and spices that increase the flavor without having the challenge of the additional sugar and additional sodium that you would get with salt.
And I would just like to add something about the added sugar issue. I think that there's really little scientific question that sugars added to beverages are harmful to our health. But I think the question is, the question about the harmful effects of added sugars to solid foods is not entirely resolved. And so small amounts of added sugars to some products, say baked goods, etc., may not be especially harmful. And sugars are added to food for purposes sometimes other than just taste. For instance, they have a role in moisture retention or texture. And so, I think that a large amount of added sugars is something to avoid, but a few grams is not something that I think that you should necessarily be not consuming the food.
Ed, would you like to go for the next ones?
Sure. I just want to say, backtrack for a minute. We did have a question about eggs. Should we be consuming eggs? And my response to that is not a question for nutritionists. That's a question for your financial advisor. This must be a tough room. I'm hearing a lull here. So obviously the consideration of nutritional factors in eggs has gone back and forth. I think eggs are still considered reasonable foods. They have very high quality protein. The yolk of egg actually contains some vitamins and minerals. And so, and some of those are emerging as having potential roles in presenting some chronic diseases, some of the carotenoids. So I don't recall the party line about the number of eggs per day or per week, but I think eggs could be considered a nutritional high quality food if not consumed in excess. And I think it's still somewhat controversial about whether the cholesterol in eggs really contributes to our blood cholesterol. Okay, let's move on. There was a question about how much protein should a 68-year-old man consume. I'm presuming that the person who asked is 68 years old, but as we age, some people believe that our protein requirement increases. Right now, the party line is that Our protein intake for older adults should be more or less similar to younger adults. But there is evidence that we are less responsive to the protein, to dietary protein as we age. It's called anabolic inhibition, and it doesn't stimulate as much protein synthesis. So it would not surprise me that if in the not too distant future, recommendations were made for a modest increase in protein intake for those, say, over 65. You know, when I say modest, oh, looks, Sarah, you have something to say?
No, finish, and then I'll just add something, and then it'll allow me to answer one of the questions in the chat.
Okay. Yeah, but when we say modest, I mean, if 0.83 grams per kilogram, which is kind of hard to wrap your head around, but you know, if that's the current recommendation, you know, it might be something increased to 1.2 or 1.3. You know, we're not going to see a doubling or tripling of the requirement.
So this is a really important question that's being addressed right now by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And indeed, one of the questions is someone who did their medical training at Tufts Medical School wants to know what the best place to get the current recommendations for protein, carbohydrates, and fat. So the macronutrients, protein, carbohydrates, and fat are being reviewed as we speak now. So we will be seeing changes within the year. The dietary reference intakes are the best source of guidance regarding protein, carbohydrate, and fat. And specific to this question from the gentleman about how much protein he should consume, bear in mind that the average American already eats quite a bit more protein than the minimum requirements. So even if the requirements go up for older adults, there are very few older adults who are not meeting those protein requirements now, particularly if they're eating a healthy diet. Thanks, Ed.
Sure. And there was a follow-up to the question about how should protein intake be broken up throughout the day? And that remains an open question. There is some evidence that consuming protein between meals might have a benefit in terms of stimulating muscle synthesis, but I think that should not be the general recommendation. And so these days, especially with recommendations that some people follow for intermittent fasting, it would be impossible to time your meals and protein throughout the day. So I think that, you know, the bottom line is that you should, you know, get what you need on a daily basis and not worry about the specific timing. Now, some of the studies about timing have been conducted in people who have age-related muscle loss or sarcopenia. And while, you know, as we age, we do lose muscle mass, I don't think that the recommendations for preventing the worsening of sarcopenia or even presenting sarcopenia should something we all should all try to follow. Okay, the next two questions are kind of loaded ones. One is it inevitable that we gain weight as we age, and is it harder to lose weight? And you know, the question is it inevitable is different from do we gain weight as we age? And we do, and it's on average about a pound a year. But it's not inevitable. It's a combination of what we're eating, our certain dietary patterns, as well as our levels of physical activity. As we age, we do lose lean body mass, especially muscle mass, and gain fat mass, but it is possible that your weight can remain constant. It's just on average, it doesn't seem to happen. And older people are able to lose weight. It's very possible. You know, one of the problems is that as your muscle mass decreases, your calorie requirements decrease. And although you are expending less energy, you may be consuming the same amount, which promotes weight gain and may seem like that it is harder to lose weight. We'll move on to the next question, also a loaded one, and that's about low carbohydrate and ketotic diets. And one of the questions was about what's the Tufts take on this? Well, I'm not going to speak for Tufts. I'll give you my own take. I don't know who speaks for Tufts on this, but there isn't a lot of research on ketotic diets per se being done at Tufts, at least to my knowledge. So ketotic diets are really, by definition, low in carbohydrate because you need to prevent the body from secreting insulin in order to be able to make ketones. In the short term, as was mentioned in the first part of the presentation, in the short term, there's pretty good evidence that following a ketotic diet, in contrast to some other diet plans, can help you lose weight. And it's not just so-called water weight, which you lose when you first start to diet. It's actual body weight and body fat. So in the short term, and we're talking, the short term might be up to 6 months or even a year, people who consume ketotic diets generally lose a little more weight than people following different diet plans. But at the end of the day, it's how much you eat. It's the energy that you're eating. Although some people would claim that the carbohydrate that we consume stimulates insulin and other hormones, which makes it harder to lose weight. And there may be some truth to it. But ultimately, it's your ability to adhere to a diet plan that will determine how much weight you're going to lose or not. The problem with ketotic diets is the longer term picture. And there are very few studies out there that demonstrate that these diets are feasible to follow in the long term, especially when you think about our food environment. Think about having the amount of carbohydrate that might be found in 2 slices of bread or an English muffin or something like that. That's your daily carbohydrate intake. That's very hard to do living in our food environment. And so the feasibility is one issue. How well it works. People who have been following low carbohydrate diets for a long time tend to gain weight. There are some studies about maybe 15, 20 years ago that showed that everyone who loses weight tends to regain it, including people who are on sort of low carbohydrate diets. The third issue is the health consequences. In the short term, I think the only predictable problem could be constipation, but in the longer term, there are increases in blood lipids. It may predispose to gout. There are other health problems. And so it's unclear if following a low carbohydrate diet or a ketotic diet in the long term is really going to be beneficial to your health. Now, there are some conditions where ketotic diets have been studied better than others. One is with autism, and there is some evidence that ketotic diets benefit autistic behaviors for those who are on the autism spectrum. But again, I'm not sure, and I'm not really familiar with this literature, I'm not sure that there are long-term studies. And then following low carbohydrate and or ketotic diets does tend to prevent people from developing diabetes if they have prediabetes. And it can help control diabetes, especially for people with type 2 diabetes, which is characterized by insulin resistance. I think it may be a little dangerous to try this with type 1 diabetes, given the balance between needing to really accurately give yourself insulin in response to various amounts of carbohydrate. So that is at least my take on these diets. I think long-term data we still need, but there are some health conditions that they may actually, be beneficial. All right, and then there was another question semi-related to this, which is on the metabolic confusion diet. Now, the metabolic confusion diet is one where on one day you consume a lower amount of calories or energy, and the next day you consume a higher amount, and it's meant to confuse your body, because if you consistently substantially reduce your intake, then your body responds by expending less energy. But this is actually a diet plan that kind of resembles intermittent fasting in a lot of ways, which is really gaining some traction. So I think that under a different name, there may be some promise. I could only actually find one research study on the metabolic confusion diet, which doesn't mean that there wasn't a lot of information about it on the internet.
And I think, Ed, you've sort of hit the nail on the head. There's a lot of enthusiasm for a lot of specific diet programs that may actually, the enthusiasm may not be matched by the actual scientific evidence. And so on that, somebody asked, what spices do you think a senior should try to include in their diet? I would use the spices that make the food taste good and that's in the recipe. Spices, and I did say earlier, so I should clarify now, I'm seeing this question. Spices are a really good way of adding flavor to your food. And but there are no super spices. There has been a lot of interest in a few of them. The one that comes to mind right now is curcumin, but the amounts of the active ingredient in curcumin, you'd just be eating curcumin and nothing else, and then you would have some much more serious problems. So I would just say enjoy your food, add spices where you want to enhance the flavor of the food, but do not look to spices to correct a health condition or promote longevity. The super spices do not exist. Ed, speaking of superfoods.
Yeah, so super supplements, there's a lot of collagen supplement sales going on out there now. While collagen, either whole collagen, which is a protein typically found in animals, or collagen peptides, which is a partially digested protein, they actually have become very popular in supplements, and they have been touted to benefit skin and to benefit joints, and especially in people with osteoarthritis. There is some evidence that they may have benefits with skin. Again, I'm not sure that, I don't really follow that literature, but there is some literature that they benefit skin, although I would be cautious because much of that was funded by the people that actually make the supplements. There also have been some studies in people with osteoarthritis, say knee osteoarthritis or hip osteoarthritis, and they're not entirely consistent, but there is a little bit of evidence suggesting that there may be a benefit to either stiffness or pain. But again, not a panacea. So that's the best I can do for you with collagen supplements. I think the jury is still out. And I'm not sure, if I was seeing someone as a patient, I'm not sure I would recommend that they take collagen supplements.
Great, thank you. I'm going to combine two of the questions because in some ways they're interrelated. and that is what foods and/or supplements should be consumed to build bone density. It's confusing if dairy is good or inflammatory, and if calcium supplements are bad for your heart. Somebody else asked the question, is there new information about health conditions or diseases caused by nutrient deficiencies in women as they progress from their 50s to their 90s? So the supplements that the nutrients that we know need to be consumed to maintain bone density, particularly as we age and transition from 50s through to 90s and 100s as we become centenarians, are calcium and vitamin D. They are challenging nutrients, particularly as we get older, and Ed mentioned, as we get older, our energy requirements go down. So we have to pack a lot of nutrients into less food, which is always becomes a little more challenging because it means you have less calories for things that may not be considered as nutrient dense, such as chocolate that Marie mentioned in the beginning. So for that reason, a number of people do need to take calcium and vitamin D as a supplement, particularly in the Northeast during the winter months. And indeed, all the osteoporotic drugs that are used for treating osteoporosis were tested in the context of adequate calcium and vitamin D. So the assumption is you need adequate calcium and D for osteoporotic drugs to really maximize their efficacy. Now one of the big challenges is vitamin D about 15 years ago just became the super nutrient. And those of us in the nutrition field were just astonished at how this nutrient, because there was a measure of it in the clinic, your blood vitamin D level, all of a sudden vitamin D was being attributed to every single, as a prophylaxis for every chronic disease. And people, it's in our society, our philosophy is something is good, more is better. And this is unfortunately the complete antithesis of how we should approach nutrition, because we have a colleague who talks about Goldilocks and porridge. So we all need sufficient nutrients for health. So if it's too cold, you're going to suffer from ill health. But if you eat too much of a given nutrient, you are also, if it's too hot, you are also going to cause disease. So there's a sweet spot, which is why we have dietary recommendations, reference intakes, which are then transformed into proposed dietary patterns. One of our big concerns in the nutrition field right now is there was so much emphasis on vitamin D over the last decade, and there were definitely unsubstantiated claims, particularly in the social media. You saw them in magazines, to consume very, very large amounts of vitamin D. The data now suggests, now we have experience of people taking too much vitamin D, that there is a sweet spot for vitamin D intake that falls right in line with the dietary recommendations. So, for example, you asked about nutritional deficiencies. The big concern now is people who've been taking like 4,000 or 5,000 international units of vitamin D for years. Those people are now presenting with bone loss and greater risk of hip fracture. So new information is, if people have gone too far over and overtake vitamin D, they're doing probably as much damage to the bone as if they were slightly under. So the message is, and I pulled it up, somebody said, so given all the caveats you've been discussing, is the best guideline to follow everything in moderation? Absolutely, because when you overtake based on unsubstantiated claims, you can also cause health problems. With regards to the dairy and the calcium supplements, there is a tendency, particularly in recent years, to demonize individual foods. And There is, as Ed always says, there's no bad food. And dairy is not a good or bad. For some people, they can't tolerate dairy, but people who can, again, in moderation. With the calcium supplements bad for your heart, there is absolutely no evidence to demonstrate that taking your calcium supplements, which you have to take with vitamin D to support bone health, they are not going to accumulate in your heart. And the physiology just doesn't make sense. And it's been a story that is being perpetuated by a few people who want to demonize calcium. But there's elegant studies showing that there is no detrimental effect of the calcium supplements taken in recommended amounts for the heart. So I'll get off my soapbox there, Ed, and you can take over.
Well, but dairy has been the target of some criticism, in part, because some people believe that it may create inflammation in the body, and indeed there are a number of foods that tend to promote low-level inflammation as opposed to quiet inflammation. Another issue about dairy, especially milk, is that there is an allowable amount of white blood cells from the cow's udder that is allowed in milk. Some people would call it pus. And when you say there is pus in milk, it really makes people think, should I be drinking this stuff? One of the issues, though, is that there is very little research about the adequacy of fortified non-dairy milks, such as from nuts or oats or etc. And before we throw dairy out and replace it with some of these alternative, quote, milks, it would be nice to show that at least there are the same nutritional benefits in terms of the availability of calcium, as well as the quality of the protein. Okay, all right. So we did have a question about a couple of questions about dietary supplements. How do you know you're taking too many? And I have to answer that question with a question: why are you taking any dietary supplements? So the question is, are you convinced that the supplements are A, helping you, and B, aren't hurting you? I have no problem if they are benign and you believe they're conferring a health benefit. But in the absence of that, I'm not exactly sure why you might be considering dietary supplements. Obviously calcium, vitamin D. In older people, vitamin B12 becomes more of an issue, and I think vitamin B12 supplements can be important for some people. But there are many others that are taken, and there is very little evidence, and indeed some evidence of harm in some of them. And Sarah will provide the website when we provide websites, of a very valuable resource at the National Institutes of Health for assessing dietary supplements and helping you decide what you want to take. There was also a question about can dietary supplements harm digestive enzymes, or can be damaging to your liver? I'm not terribly familiar about effects on digestive enzymes, although some of them may inhibit the effects somewhat. But there is liver toxicity with some of dietary supplements, especially that could be dose related. Also, some dietary supplements up or down regulate the enzymes in your liver, which either activate drugs or metabolize drugs. So if you are taking medications, it would be important to figure out if you're also taking dietary supplements that do that. Okay, there was a question about proton pump inhibitors, or those are drugs that reduce the acid in your stomach, and are there nutritional consequences? And the answer is maybe. There's some evidence that these can decrease your ability to digest the vitamin B12 that comes with animal foods. And it's not just a particular proton pump inhibitor. It's basically most of the anti-acid drugs that are taken that suppress gastric acid or stomach acid. So if you need to take one of those drugs over a long period of time, it's worth discussing with your doctor whether or not you should have your vitamin B12 checked. Another question about diverticulitis, and diverticulitis is when there are outpouchings in the colon, which become very common with aging. And when something gets stuck in there, such as food or dried stool, and it causes inflammation and infection. So the best thing to do is to minimize the likelihood of developing diverticula, as well as getting things stuck, and that's with dietary fiber. Once you actually have the infection, fiber isn't going to help you. Matter of fact, you may not be eating much at all until the infection simmers down, or take antibiotics, etc. And I think we had one more of the advanced questions that, and this is, no, actually, yes, this is the one I'm going to let Dr. Booth handle, and that is, what about the scientific status of GMOs? Are they bad for soil? Are they bad for plants? And are they bad for people?
The answer is, I don't know. The GMOs that are food-based undergo a lot of rigorous testing. I think there's a lot of controversy about long-term impact on the environment, but I just don't feel qualified to answer that question. And I think it depends on the GMO.
Yeah, there is some evidence that GMO in crops may drift to adjacent fields and create problems with resistance, say, to certain pesticides, whatever. But again, neither of us follow that literature. So you'll have to get some plant people and agriculture people to come back.
Thank
And
you so much, Sarah and Ed, for this really fascinating talk. I'm going to pass it off to Linda for some final remarks.
Hi, I'm over here. Linda Dixon here from the Senior Connection. Welcome, everybody. Well, we were thrilled to host a return visit from Professor Sarah Booth for another excellent program on nutrition. And this time it was made special by her collaboration with her husband, Ed Salzman. So, and this time it was a Zoom call, and looking at all the gallery of people tuning in was really quite interesting. I must tell you about a very special Tufts travel opportunity that involves Sarah Booth and nutrition. From September 29 to October 7, Tufts is sponsoring Flavors of Sicily, featuring visits to renowned archaeological sites, delicious cuisine and wine, a private villa as your home base, and Sarah Booth as faculty host, speaking on the myth.
And Ed Saltzman.
Oh, Ed is coming to, well, I wasn't aware of that, but
yes.
I'm going to leave him home.
Double the trouble.
And they're going to speak on the myth of the Mediterranean diet. Now, am I a travel agent or what? Does that sound like a fantastic trip? We're going to include the information link to this trip in your survey. And we are always looking for creative program ideas. And this is a creative audience. So if you have an idea for a future program topic, please mention it in your survey. We'd like to thank Hannah Clifford, our producer, for making everything run smoothly tonight. We had a large audience and everything went really well. Thank you, Hannah. This concludes our presentation. Thank you all for your participation and your support. You're a great audience. This is it. See you next time. Good evening, everybody.